October 20th, 1944. Somewhere on the Hungarian plain, the morning light is thin and cold. A gray fog rolls low across fields that smell of diesel, wet earth, and something heavier, the kind of air you only breathe on a battlefield. Somewhere out ahead, hidden in the treelines and the mist, the Red Army is moving, and it is moving in force. Walter Mattern sits in the cupola of his Panzer IV. He has 8 tanks. 8. Against the Soviet formation that includes T-34 divided by 85s. A tank that, by this point in the war, is the most battle-proven medium tank on the planet. His infantrymen, roughly 500 of them, are already fanning out into the brush. Mattern scans the horizon through his commander's optics. He does not look afraid. He looks like a man running calculations. By the end of the day, 13 Soviet tanks will be burning on that plain. More than 150 enemy soldiers will be dead or wounded, and of Mattern's 8 tanks and 500 men, not one will be lost. 13-0. This is the story of how that happened. To understand what Walter Mattern accomplished that day, you have to first understand what he was working with, and what was working against him. Mattern was 31 years old in 1944. Born in Braunschweig in 1913, he had come up through the ranks of the Waffen-SS and now commanded the 7th Company of the 3rd SS Panzer Regiment, part of the 3rd SS Panzer Division, Totenkopf, the Death's Head Division. By late 1944, Totenkopf was a veteran formation, blooded across years of savage fighting on the Eastern Front. The men who survived to this point were not green conscripts. They were hardened professionals. But even professionals have limits, and in the autumn of 1944, those limits were being tested every single day. Germany was losing the war. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive of 1944, had shattered Army Group's center. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were dead, captured, or scattered. The Red Army was no longer just pushing, it was rolling. And in Hungary, in the Carpathian Basin, German forces were scrambling to build defensive lines that could delay what almost everyone privately understood was inevitable. Against this backdrop, Mattern's 8 Panzer IVs were not a strike force. They were a plug in a crumbling wall. Now, the Panzer IV is worth examining carefully, because the popular image of German armor in 1944 tends to revolve around the Tiger and the Panther. Those were the headline machines, heavy, powerful, intimidating. The Panzer IV was something humbler. It had been designed before the war as an infantry support vehicle, and by 1944 it was fighting in a world it was never quite built for. The T-34/85 it faced that October could punch through a Panzer IV's frontal armor at combat ranges. The math was not flattering, but the Panzer IV had 2 qualities that elite crews could exploit to devastating effect. The first was its gun, the 7.5 cm KWK-40L/48. Long, accurate, and fast-firing, this weapon could penetrate a T-34 from over 1,000 meters, especially targeting the sides and rear. The second asset was the Carl Zeiss optics that equipped German tank commanders and gunners. German crews could identify a target, range it, and lay a precise shot on it, sometimes before a Soviet crew even knew they were being watched. In the right hands, the Panzer IV was not obsolete. It was a scalpel, and Mattern knew exactly how to use it. The first thing Mattern did on October 20th was something that often gets overlooked when people analyze armored engagements. He listened to his infantry. 500 men sounds like a lot of support for 8 tanks. But Mattern understood that those infantrymen were not just there to hold ground, they were his nervous system. A tank crew, when buttoned up for combat, is nearly blind. The armor that keeps you alive also seals you into a small, noisy, dark box with maybe a 10-degree field of view through your optics. Mattern's infantry changed that equation completely. His soldiers moved through the treelines and depressions ahead of the tanks, reporting back, by radio, by signal, by pyrotechnics, the positions and movements of Soviet armor. When a T-34 fired at German infantry, the muzzle flash gave away its position. When a Soviet crew tried to move, someone on the ground saw them first and passed the word. The infantrymen also formed a physical barrier against the tank hunter teams that the Red Army used effectively. Soldiers armed with grenades, Molotov cocktails, or anti-tank rifles, who could disable or destroy a tank at close range if they could get near it. This is not a romantic or dramatic element of the battle. There is no single moment where the infantry saves the day in some cinematic sense. But strip those 500 men away, and Mattern's 8 tanks are isolated, half-blind, and vulnerable. With them, his tanks became the tip of a coordinated weapon. Now here is where Mattern's personal genius entered the picture. He did not fight the way the Soviets expected him to fight. With only 8 vehicles, a straightforward line engagement against a numerically superior force would have been suicidal. Mattern had no interest in that. Instead, his tanks moved in small groups, using a tactic that combined the German kiel, the wedge formation, with something that experienced armored commanders understand as shoot and scoot. The principle is simple. You fire from one position, then you move, before the enemy can calculate your range and return fire. You never let them lock onto you. You appear from one angle, engage, disappear, and reappear from another. Done with a company of tanks, this creates profound confusion. Soviet commanders, hearing fire from multiple directions, receiving fragmentary reports from their own crews, begin to miscount. What looked like 8 tanks starts to feel like 20. Mattern divided his company into at least 2 maneuvering elements. One group would take elevated ground or a prepared position, fire to draw attention and suppress, to force Soviet crews to button up and limit their visibility. Meanwhile, the second group moved through a depression, along a tree line, around the edge of a field, to get into a flanking position. And the flanks of AT-34/85, like most tanks of the era, were significantly more vulnerable than the front. The German 75mm gun could penetrate T-34 side armor at considerable range, meaning Mattern's crews did not need to close in dangerously. They could sit at distance and work. One by one, the Soviet tanks were isolated, surprised, and killed. But there is still the question that sits at the center of this entire engagement. How did 8 Panzer IVs survive without a single loss? The answer is the hold-on position, combined with an absolute mastery of terrain. A hold-on position is exactly what it sounds like. You use a ridge, an embankment, a slope, anything the landscape offers, to hide the body of the tank while only the turret and gun are exposed. For a vehicle like the Panzer IV, which was not going to win any armor comparison tests in 1944, this was not merely a good tactic. It was a survival imperative. Mattern had an eye for ground. He read the Hungarian plain the way a chess player reads a board, not just where things are, but where they will be, where the sight lines run, where the dead ground is, where a tank can reverse out of trouble without crossing an exposed crest. Every position he chose for his tanks had a planned withdrawal route. Every hold-down spot he selected gave his gunners a clean field of fire, while offering the absolute minimum target profile to the enemy. In the autumn mist, with the low sun throwing long shadows, and with smoke rising from multiple firing positions, Mattern's tanks were extraordinarily difficult to locate precisely. Soviet gunners were shooting at muzzle flashes, at probable positions, at smoke. They were almost never shooting at a clearly visible tank. Mattern's crews were not saved by thick armor. They were saved by the fact that the enemy could barely see them. The German commander's cupola, with its vision blocks offering a wide panoramic view, gave Mattern and his platoon commanders a significant observational advantage over Soviet counterparts whose vehicles were less well equipped for situational awareness when closed down. In tank combat, the crew that spots first, aims first, and fires first wins the exchange in the vast majority of cases. Mattern structured the entire engagement to ensure that it was always his crews doing the spotting and the aiming first. When you step back and look at October 20th, 1944 as a whole, it is not one dramatic moment that explains the outcome. It is the layering of advantages. An infantry screen that provided intelligence and prevented close assault. Flexible fire and maneuver tactics that multiplied confusion in the enemy command. Flanking approaches that targeted Soviet armor at its weakest angles. Hold-on positions chosen by a man who understood terrain at an intuitive level. Optics that let German crews engage accurately at ranges where Soviet return fire was far less precise. And underneath all of it, experienced crew, a ruthless discipline about never staying still, never being predictable, never giving the enemy a clean shot. 13 Soviet tanks destroyed. The regimental level attack halted and thrown back. The German line held, at least for another day. For this action, Walter Mattern was awarded the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military decoration for battlefield valor. It was recognition of something real, that on this 1 October afternoon, a company commander had turned what should have been an impossible situation into a textbook engagement. And yet, Mattern's brilliance that day did not change the arc of the war. The Red Army absorbed those 13 lost tanks the way an ocean absorbs a stone. The German defensive effort in Hungary ground on through the winter of 1944 and into 1945. Consuming men and machines at a rate no tactical genius could offset. The 3rd SS Panzer Division, Totenkopf, fought on until the final weeks of the war. Many of the men who moved through that autumn fog in Hungary would not survive to see the spring. Walter Mattern survived. He returned to Braunschweig, the same city where he was born, and lived there until his death in 1974. He was 61 years old. What he carried from the war, we cannot know. The Knight's Cross is a piece of metal with a ribbon. It does not translate easily into the language of ordinary civilian life, but the tactical record he left behind speaks clearly enough. On one gray October day on the Hungarian plain, with 8 aging tanks and 500 soldiers, he ran an engagement that military historians still point to as an illustration of what disciplined, intelligent armored command looks like at its best. 13-0.